Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and admirers of Iqbal, 50 years ago, on April 21st, 1938, Iqbal closed his eyes to this transient world to continue his infinite journey into the depths of the divine. It seems to me very fitting that the last visitor whom he saw shortly before passing away in the evening of the 20th April was a German philosopher, Wertheim Ostrau, who in his memoirs has described how for hours and hours he discussed the problems of German philosophy and particularly the greatness of Goethe with the dying Indo-Muslim poet-philosopher. That shows that Iqbal indeed forms a bridge between the two worlds, and that is probably because I loved him so dearly when I read first his Payam al-Mashriq when I was a very young student in Berlin. A man who is capable of loving at the same time our greatest German poet, Goethe, and the greatest of all mystical poets in the Islamic world, Maulana Rumi, must, so I thought at that point, a person whom I should study. And so I did it. And the study of Iqbal, I confess, led me deeper and deeper, not only in the history of Islamic literatures, but into the history of Muslim thought in general, of mysticism on the one hand, and of literary expression on the other hand. It seems to me that among all the poets we have in the Indian subcontinent, Iqbal is the one who is easiest to understand for modern men. And as a translator, I have often felt that his message can be translated into, let me say, German poetry without losing too much of its beauty, because it is a message that appeals to everyone who has ears to hear. Iqbal, as we all know, comes from the Punjab, hailing from a Kashmiri family that settled in Sialkot. He got his degrees in Lahore, then in Cambridge, and spent much of his time in studying law and neo-Hegelian philosophy. But it was Germany that became his spiritual home. He spent several months in Heidelberg, and his friend Atiya Begum, a very brave Bohra lady, one of the first Indian Muslim ladies ever to leave India and to see Europe, she describes his enthusiasm for German literature and German life. Iqbal was all for German knowledge, she said. And when I met her in 1958 in Karachi, she convinced me that it was really like this. In any case, Iqbal decided to write his dissertation in a German university. It was Munich, where Professor Schimmel, the professor of Semitic languages, became his Doktorvater. And there is another interesting connection. Professor Schimmel was the successor of Ernst Trump, the German philologist and missionary who for the first time had studied the languages of what is now Pakistan, had written the first scholarly grammars of Sindhi and Pashto, had translated the Adi Granth from Punjabi into English, and had worked on Balochi and Brahui. Thus, there seemed to be a certain mysterious attraction in the Munich chair for Iqbal. And his dissertation, which he published in 1908, deals with the development of metaphysics in Iran. It is a thesis which was applauded warmly by scholars like E.G. Brown in Cambridge, and which has served as a basis for his later thoughts, although in many cases he later on turned over his ideas completely, reversed his standpoint toward Rumi and toward an Islamic mystic like Al-Hallaj. But it was after his return to Lahore that he began to observe more carefully the fate of the Indian Muslims. He had been known as a good poet in Urdu already previous to his sojourn in Europe, but it was now that he was inspired to turn his poetry to the fate of his compatriots and his co-religionists. We can see the break in his development in his Stray Reflections, a small notebook which his son Javed Iqbal has edited, and in which he acknowledges his deep debt towards German scholarship, and particularly toward Goethe, but also toward the great Indian poets Mirza Bedil, who died in 1721, and Mirza Ghalib, the greatest of all the Urdu writers, who died in 1869. It was from his criticism of European politics and the European social life that he tried to understand the plight of the Muslims of his time. And in his great poem, Shikwa, he has asked God why he has forsaken his people, the ones who brought the message of unity to the world and are now the lowest of the low. In the Shikwa, a great musaddas, a poem in 6-line stanzas, he followed the example of Hali, who in his musaddas of 1879 had expressed the same concern for the fate of the Muslims who were now smarting under British domination. But Iqbal's Shikwa was not his last word. There comes the Jawab Shikwa, in which he opens up the divine revelation, and God is heard scolding the faithless Muslims who are too lazy to get up for their morning prayers, who are too well-fed to keep the fast in Ramadan, and who have forgotten the divine commands. After this, a poem which was written still in Urdu, Iqbal found that his message could reach larger segments of the Muslim population in the world if he would turn to the language of classical literature, to Persian. And it is here that his first great Masnavi, a poem in rhyming couplets, was published in 1915 in the middle of World War I. The Asrar al-Khudi, the secrets of the self, give a completely different picture from what Persian poetry had been for the last 700 years. He himself tells, and his family told me too, how Maulana Rumi, the great mystical poet, appeared to him and bade him write a poem in order to call the sleeping Muslims to wake up and do their duties. Maulana Rumi had been interpreted for the almost 700 years that passed after his death as an interpreter of the Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, as it was advocated in the school of Ibn Arabi. It was Iqbal who for the first time rediscovered the dynamic aspect of Rumi's poetry, an aspect which does not call for man's self-effacement in the ocean of the divine, but rather for man's development until he comes closer and closer to the divine beloved. It is the concept of khudi, self, or as it has often been translated, but I don't think very well, ego, which form the center of Iqbal's new message. And it is very revealing to see that this word, which had gained a negative aspect in later Sufi poetry, has been used by Rumi in his prose work in the sense, the very inner meaning of man, the character of man, the true selfhood by which man can reach the divine. Iqbal followed this lead, and in his poem he calls man to develop this inner self until he is able to reach the highest ring on the gamut of existence. He has been accused, understandably, for his attacks against classical Persian poetry, which seemed to him, with its dreams of poetry and rose gardens and nightingales, very dangerous, like opium. And in an article he wrote in 1916, 1 year after the Asrar had appeared, he says that there should be no opium eating in art. Art should strengthen human minds, human hearts, and art should serve to develop the best qualities in mankind. You can well imagine that most of his readers were fairly shocked when they read Iqbal's ideas about the development of self. And it didn't take long for them to accuse them of being an imitator of Nietzsche with his idea of the Superman. But if you go through Iqbal's work, you see that there is no idea of a Superman in the Nietzschean sense, because Nietzsche's Superman can only appear after God is dead, while Iqbal's Mard Momin is the one who appears at the moment when he is closest to God. And his Mard Momin is, in reality, a development of certain trends that can be found in earlier Sufism as well. If you read the poetry of Sanai and Attar and Maulana Rumi, you find always the call, where is the real man of God, so that he could guide us and could lead us out of this stage where mankind are kal-an'am bal hum adal, like animals, but even more astray. Iqbal then published another Masnavi on the duties of the fully developed person in the community 2 years later, the Asrar-e-Khudi, in which he shows that not only the individual has the duty to develop its talents to its highest possible rank, but that also the nation, the Muslim nation, should do that. The Muslim nation is for him the great witness to the unity of God, unity of the sacred book, unity of the final prophet, unity of the direction in prayer. In short, we are, as he says in a short notice in the Stray Reflection, we are the last true witnesses to God's unity, and as such we are required in world history. Then comes his next great book, a book that is particularly dear to us Germans because it is the first and only answer to Goethe's Westöstlicher Divan, in which the German poet had taken up ideas of Hafiz and other Persian poets, and which is one of the finest receptions of Oriental poetry in general. Iqbal found in Goethe something that appealed tremendously to him. On the one hand, it was his understanding of the prophetic spirit as it is expressed in Goethe's poem Mahomets Gesang, where Goethe describes the prophet and his life and duty under the image of a river that carries away with it everything that comes into his way to bring it home into the arms of the eternal Father, the ocean. Iqbal gave a free Persian version of this poem. And the second aspect in Goethe that fascinated him was the idea of the constant striving, the constant longing for something higher, the idea that has been expressed most perfectly in Goethe's Faust, which, according to Iqbal's own idea, is nothing short of divine workmanship. This eternal striving, Kushish Tamam or Sudash Tamam, is a theme that permeates Iqbal's poetry from the Asrar to his last works written in the year of his death. It is a striving which he wanted to teach his co-religionists, a striving which does not rest even after death. In fact, death is for him only one of the numerous stages of life. Death is something on which the believer jumps like a lion jumps on a gazelle, and then if he is strong enough to survive spiritually the shock of corporeal death, then there will be no end to his development in eternal life in the abysses of God. Heaven, says Iqbal in his lecture, heaven is no holiday. Even there, the continuous development goes on because God is infinite, and so the possibilities in him are likewise infinite. And when Iqbal learned this message of constant striving, wer immer strebend sich bemüht, den können wir erlösen, as Goethe says, only the one who is always striving and in quest can find salvation. The end, which he also found in the works of Attar and Maulana Rumi, the third element in the Goethe world was that of Mephistopheles, of the devil, Iblis, for whom he has developed a very interesting role in human history. When it was said in classical Islamic tradition, and particularly in the Sufi tradition, that the nafs, the lower soul that is between man's ribs, is the worst enemy against which one has to wage the greater holy war, then Iqbal invented the fascinating myth that Iblis and his seduction of Adam was necessary for the development of man. As the Quran teaches that Iblis did not prostrate himself before the newly created Adam because he thought, Ana khairun, I am better than him. Thus, Iqbal finds that this pride certainly deserves punishment. However, without his seduction, Adam would have remained continuously and in eternity in a paradise of colors and scents, while it is a constant struggle against the quality of evil, against Satan embodied in various forms, that makes him really into a human being. And thus, Satan is necessary for the development of the single individual as much as for the development of the world. And in an ingenious verse in the Payam al-Mashriq, he has described this development of the world. And finally, he comes to acknowledge that Satan, at the end of the world, when he has been overcome and thrown into the dust by the perfected human being, he will fall down and perform the prostration which he would not have done before the newly created immature Adam. Thus, the Mephistophelian aspect of Iqbal's work belongs to the most ingenious parts and the most thought-provoking strands in his whole philosophy. After the Payam al-Mashriq, which was published in 1923, comes a collection of his early Urdu poems, the Bang-Dara, the title of which is again telling, because Iqbal, in one of his most famous Urdu poems, calls himself the sound of the caravan bell. He feels like the caravan bell that is tied to the camel which leads the caravan of faithful through the desert into the central sanctuary of Islam, to the Kaaba in Mecca. It followed Zabura Ajam, a collection of partly very daring prayer poems in which the grown-up personality scolds God and has arguments with him, and again understands that the real goal in life is to cooperate with God's will, to act as a Khalifa, the vicegerent of God, following his advice and ameliorating this earth in the knowledge that the world does not belong to him, but that he has to give it back to God in a better state than he has received it. Themes that also occur in his other works. A year later, 1928, Iqbal went on a large lecture tour through various universities, and the lectures were published as the 6 lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. It were these lectures which became available to European Orientalists and were partly harshly criticized. Some Italian and also German Orientalists accused him of being unlogical, of mixing up concepts and so on, but it would be wrong to see the lectures isolated. They have to be seen as a background for his poetry, and they go together without any difficulties. And contradictions, after all, are something that we find in the works of the greatest masters. Only stones do not contradict themselves, says Iqbal in one of his letters. 1932 brings his magnum opus, the Javetname, modeled partly on Milton's Paradise Lost, partly on Dante's Divine Comedy, and showing the poet roaming through the 7 spheres in the company of his spiritual guide, Maulana Rumi. The Javetname is probably the most difficult work for a lay person to understand, but for the historian of religion it is extremely important, as it contains many remarks which are parallel to the development of history of religion in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, very often without Iqbal's having any knowledge of the European works. It was like as if he were feeling what was in the air and could express it in beautiful poetry, discussing theology, politics, poetry with the great wise men of earlier ages, whether they were Hindu sages or the Babi martyr Tahira Qurat al-Ain, or Sharaf-un-Nisa, a Punjabi princess, or other great masters of thought and poetry, whether they were Muslims or Hindus or Christians, as in the vision of Tolstoy, does not matter. His goal is to show how the seeker transgresses the various spheres. Some of his visions are extremely modern. They must have sounded utopian almost 60 years ago. And finally, he ends in the presence of God, which is growing without diminishing. Then follow some smaller works, the great Urdu book Bala Jibril, Gabriel's Wing, and then Zarb Kalim, the Stroke of Moses, in which he expresses his political ideas more clearly than elsewhere. And finally, his posthumously published collection Amran Hijaz, the gift of the Hijaz. It is an important and very impressive poetical work. What is particularly impressive is the way how Iqbal uses the language and the words of classical poetry, the forms of classical poetry, in order to convey his message. Because for him, language, as we just heard from Sohail Hashmi, was not an idol. Language was something that had to serve a higher purpose. And when someone who admired his philosophical thought in the 6 lectures asked him why he always reverted to poetry, he wrote in a letter in 1935, "I have no interest in the art of poetry, but I have some special intentions for whose declaration I have chosen the way of poetry because of the state and traditions of this country." It is true, if he had preached his ideas in a very modern style of poetry, people would have probably not listened to him. But one has to understand much of his style and of his imagery from the Indo-Pakistani tradition of the Mushaira. When you recite poetry, someone repeats a line, and if the poem is good, the next morning the whole city knows the most favorite and most beautiful verses of it. This trend of memorizing poetry and repeat it time and again was, of course, an ideal vehicle for Iqbal at a time when radio was still in its very beginnings and TV not yet invented. It was the word of poetry that really caught the fancy of the masses. And Iqbal's poetry, from the formal viewpoint, fits very well into these traditional models because he is very fond of contrasting pairs of concepts which he skillfully juxtaposes. He uses images which one knew from the classical poetry of Hafiz and Rumi, but he filled them with a new content. I always find it fascinating how he, for instance, transformed the two favorite items of classical Persian poetry, the rose and the nightingale, into something much stronger. There are some roses in his poetry, to be sure, and some nightingales too. But the nightingale is more important than the rose, because it is only thanks to longing for the beauty of the rose that the nightingale becomes a good singer, an artist, can express her heart's delight and suffering in most beautiful tunes. Only longing makes the bird productive. Only longing makes the human heart productive. But on the other hand, we find the bars, the falcon or hawk, the proud bird who does not hunt sparrows and small things, but who spreads out his wings into the eternity of the horizon, the symbol of the free man who outsoars all the others in his quest for the divine. And there is among the flowers the tulip, Lala, a flower which has always been connected in Persian poetry with suffering and martyrdom. The red tulips are wearing the shrouds of the martyrs, either the martyrs of Karbala or the martyrs of love. And for Iqbal, this flower, which grows lonely in the desert, manifests the will to manifestation, the dhawq numud, the longing and the enthusiasm to show oneself. It struggles until it comes out of the dark bulb, and then, in the loneliness of the desert, it burns like the flame of God on Sinai. So the Lala and the bars are two of his key concepts, and we could go on telling more and more about his way to transform classical imagery. There is a constant tendency to interpret the classical heritage in terms of Sufi experience, even though one knows that he has condemned pantheistic Sufism in very harsh words. But he knows, as all the great religious leaders of the world, and not only of the Muslim world, but the same is true for Christianity, he knows that there has to be a constant interplay of the two qualities of life, the jalwa and the khalwa. The jalwa being the manifestation, the khalwa coming back into oneself. Life, he has said in all his poems, from the beginning to the end, life is a constant change between these two states. The heart needs the khalwa, the loneliness, in which it can talk in lonesome prayer with God. And by touching God in the desert or in the ocean of its loneliness, it gains new strength. And while the mystic in the pure sense, wants to stay forever in this sweet conversation with God, the prophetic spirit goes out in order to manifest himself, and through himself the greatness of God. He tries to implement in the nation and in his people what he has experienced during his solitude with God. This is one of the central ideas of Iqbal, and it fits absolutely into the concept of history of religion. It is not only this constant change between the two stages which is necessary for human life, just as the change of the heartbeat or the in-breathing and out-breathing is necessary for maintaining man's material life. There are other groups of contrasts too, and one of them, of which he speaks almost in all his works, is that of ilm and ishq. They are again related to the jalwa and khalwa. Ilm, scholarship, had been often criticized in the Sufi tradition. Ilm is a knowledge which is fine and necessary for the beginning. It can also be replaced by aql, by intellect, and this too is necessary as a guide on the way. Mankind need intellect and knowledge in order to find the way toward God. But once one has arrived there on the long way, there is no need of relying on the intellect anymore. That is what Rumi says. Iqbal goes even farther. He sees in aql or in ilm the modern powers of intellectualism, of an analysis without synthesis. He sees in the modern world the dangers of a loveless intellect which serve to analyze everything and never to bring together anything. It is from this vantage point that his numerous poems, particularly Al-Ashq and Payam al-Mashriq, but many others, are written. And for him, Ashq is not only love in the narrow sense, love is the divine power, the inspirational power which moves everything and everyone in the world. It is this power which is manifested in Gabriel and in the prophet and in all the great lovers who strive in quest of God, which is his ideal. Not so much a love on the worldly plan, nothing comparable to Platonic love in the classical sense, but a love which is the element of fire that really makes man move into the divine presence. As he says once, Abraham, love jumped into the fire like Abraham. Intellect was still standing on the roof and didn't dare to do it. It is a story of Abraham who was cast into the fire by Nimrod, and the fire became for him cool and pleasant, as the Quran asserts. It is this powerful love, a love which is the only and true element in human life, which Iqbal advocates. And this love shows itself in the great heroes of Islamic history, in the great martyrs from Hussein in Karbala beginning to Mansur ibn Hussein ibn Mansur al-Hallaj in Baghdad. These two pairs of contrast, Khalwa and Jalwa, and Aql and Ashq, or Ilm and Ashq, are in a certain way the grid on which Iqbal's poetry develops. He has never logically analyzed his viewpoint about love and intellect. He has made some remarks in his lectures, but it is particularly this concept of love which leads man into the abysses of the divine. Thus, Iqbal has filled the whole framework of classical Persian and Urdu poetry with his own ideas. He has done it in such a way that people became captured by listening to him, and only perhaps after listening for the second and third time, they may have realized that his message is completely different from what previous generations had taught them. And it is a message which, as I said, is not only valid for his time, but also for the future and for other people. I have sometimes called Iqbal one of the most pronounced representative of the prophetic type of religion. Not that he has not a mystical strand in him, yet the prophetic element is extremely strong in him. And that is why his poetry carries away the readers and has carried away them through the decades. His poetry is something that should be read carefully and thought and meditated, but it is also something that can be listened to, and yet by the very strength of his sound and its imagery carries you away without philosophical background. But his poetry is more. It is not a poetry which will be admired today and after decades and probably centuries for its intrinsic beauty. It is a poetry which has played a highly important historical and political role. Poetry, in his case, is active history, and history creating prophecy. That is what one can say about his work as a poet. It is not only the poetry which he has criticized in his predecessors, the poetry in which the soul falls into sweet dreams. It is a poetry which awakens man. And it's very typical that in the Javetname, Halaj, the martyr of love, addresses him, "Beware, you are doing the same thing as I have done. You are carrying resurrection to the spiritually dead." And that is exactly what Iqbal wanted. He saw his people spiritually dead, partly under the influence of fossilized interpretations of the Quran, partly under the influence of the Western powers, of Western technology and Western ideologies, and he wanted to awake them in his own way. There is one passage in the lectures which always fascinated me, because he says, "The world life intuitively sees its own need and at critical moments defines its own direction. This is what in the language of religion we call prophetic revelation." And no one less than Kenneth Craig has taken up this saying when he speaks of Iqbal himself. He says that he is the spokesman of something deep within the contemporary soul. The age then must have felt its need of him. That seems to me a very good interpretation of Iqbal's work, both as a poet, a philosopher, and a prophetic spirit. He has claimed that poetry, useless as it may be if it is just meant as beauty and as an expression of l'art pour l'art, poetry in its highest, if it is able to create human beings, to shape true men of God, which also includes women incidentally, if poetry is able to do that, then it is an heir to prophecy. And in the Javetname, he writes, The poet's nature is eternal quest, creating wishes, keeping them alive. And in the nation's breast he is a heart. Without a poet, nations are but clay. Let us hope that Pakistan will always keep this heart beating in its breast.